Justin Brierley is an author, speaker, broadcaster, and Christian. For over 2 decades, he has run shows like Unbelievable, where he's hosted dialogues between Christians and non-Christians, including people like Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, Khalili, Darren Brown, Tom Holland, Grayling, Jordan Peterson, Philip Pullman, etc., etc., many, many more. He's the author of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and he has a new book out in April, Why I Am Still a Christian After 2 Decades of Conversations with Skeptics and Atheists. So, Justin Brierley, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Thank you, Philip. It's lovely to be with you.
Your new book is a kind of a statement that you've survived, or gives the impression that you've survived after 2 decades. And it suggests, certainly in the first chapter of it, that conversations have really been very important to you in understanding maybe your own position, your own religion, and the positions of other people. You've had conversations with many, many people. Can I just begin by asking you, first of all, what was the value of those conversations for you? And have any of them stood out as being particularly significant?
Well, the value of the conversations is certainly in the fact that you learn an awful lot along the way. I was very wet behind the ears when I began hosting these conversations between Christians and atheists, and I certainly learned a lot from both sides in the course of that. And I think the value of the conversations is also that as we moved increasingly over the years that I was hosting them towards a more digital sphere, towards people interacting via social media, and all of the difficulties that brings in terms of tribalism, polarization, I think the value of talking to people face to face came into its own. And so it was really helpful, I think, to have a show while all that was going on around us that had at the center of it two people coming together with very different perspectives, but willing to hear each other and talk to each other. So there was all of that. And yes, I had some wonderful conversations along the way with some marvelous people. I suppose it's like asking me to choose between my children, really, to ask for a favorite. But one that particularly sticks in my mind was part of a series we called The Big Conversation. And in that, it was exciting and interesting because I had Tom Holland, the historian, joining me. He'd just written his sort of magnum opus, Dominion, making a case for why the West is essentially founded on Christian values. And I had him in conversation with A.C. Grayling, quite a well-known atheist philosopher, who'd written his own magnum opus, a sort of history of philosophy. And he just came at things from diametrically the opposite view, very critical.
His own Bible, I believe. I remember seeing
that. Yes, the good book, I think he called it. But with sayings and wisdom only from, other traditions other than the Bible. So anyway, it was quite a cracking debate between them, quite fierce in some ways, but very exciting. I was glad to be in the middle of it. And yeah, I suppose that one just sticks out in my memory as one of the best shows we did, in as much as it was two really significant individuals, and just a thoroughly enjoyable conversation.
Some of them can be quite combative, I would imagine.
Yes.
A.C. Grayling is going to be quite combative, I would think, in his approach.
Yes, A.C. Grayling is. And Tom Holland sort of rose to the occasion. I think one of the reasons it stuck out was because I've never seen Tom Holland quite in that mode in any other situation. He's usually very sort of, very cool, collected. But he was sort of, you could see that his heckles were rising at various points, and he was ready to make his defense, and it was quite fun to be in the middle of that.
I think you might say that Grayling brings out the worst in people, or certainly some people possibly. I don't know, but in the book that you're going to publish in April, you set out a very sort of personal response to your own Christian beliefs, and you try to lay out there a kind of apologetic, a set of reasons why you are persuaded by the Christian faith. And the first of those reasons you look at is that God makes some sense out of human existence. And I suppose one of the biggest philosophical questions is, of course, why is there something rather than nothing? And how does Christianity help you answer that?
Well, it is one of the biggest questions, and one of the most obvious questions you can sort of ask yourself, even though I think a lot of people go through life without ever asking it, in fact. And I suppose what I try to do in this book, Why I'm Still a Christian, is to compare and contrast different worldviews, specifically Christianity versus atheism or naturalism. Because in the end, I think we're all looking at the same data, the same evidence, but we're potentially using a different worldview to understand it. And I suppose the question is, well, which worldview makes best sense of the data that's available to all of us? And the fact there is a universe, the fact that we do exist, the fact that there is physical reality is an interesting data point. And the question is, does it sit better, as it were, does it fit better with the Christian worldview that there's ultimately a God behind physical reality, or the atheist naturalist viewpoint that there's no ultimate cause, if you like, that the universe just is at that level? And I think, you know, at a very simple level, the question of why is there something rather than nothing seems to fit better to me with the idea that there is something beyond nature, that there is something beyond just physical reality, because physical reality in and of itself cannot explain itself. It just is. It's a sort of, if you're an atheist naturalist, you just have to sort of accept it as a brute fact. But there's nothing about physical reality, as people like Leibniz and many other philosophers said, that is, if you like, necessary. It seems to be contingent. It could have been here. It couldn't. It might not have been here. You know, and so I'm quite persuaded by those philosophical arguments that say you need a sort of necessary thing, being, if you will, to make sense of this contingent reality we find ourselves in. So that's a sort of quite philosophical way of approaching it, and I think it does lead you towards a sort of a God conclusion. But I would say that's just one of a number of different things about the fact of human existence that, for me, point in the direction of God rather than away from God. And I suppose the bigger point here is that the new atheists, especially, were trying to use science as a way of saying we don't need God anymore. We've sort of explained human existence by purely physical processes. And the reality is that's just not true. Actually, the more we know about the universe, its origins, its extraordinary fine-tuning for the existence of life, the more it seems, in fact, to be pointing towards some kind of designer, some sort of a transcendent reality behind it, rather than to just physics and matter and so on. It's become very apparent, I think, to most people looking into this, that simply saying, oh, we just got lucky, isn't a good enough answer, actually, when you look at the extraordinary things that needed to happen for human beings to exist and to be able to reflect on our place in the universe. So all of these things, to me, point towards a God. They may not be a sort of slam dunk argument, but they certainly seem to fit better with the Christian worldview than a purely atheist one.
Can I ask you about Darwinism in particular in this context? Because I think, you know, back in the middle of the 19th century, Darwinism had a huge impact. And to me, at any rate, I think its main impact was not so much its explanation of the origin of species, but the consequential impact that you have a picture now where you no longer need God in it, that existence, certainly human existence, can be explained entirely without the need for God. What's your view of Darwinism, and how do you marry that together with your own Christian beliefs?
Well, I think Darwinism, in that sense, has often been co-opted by atheists for this theological conclusion. I don't think it's warranted, personally, even if you take Darwinism and sort of the version that Richard Dawkins prefers on its own terms, this idea that there is just this simple law acting, you know, mutation, natural selection over time gives rise to all the complexity of different species we find. Even if that is the law that's operating, it doesn't discount God by any means. There's all kinds of aspects of reality that appear to still be very dependent upon something beyond simply just this law working itself out. But I understand where Dawkins is coming from when he says Darwinism enabled me to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. You know, and I've spoken to many Darwinists who say, you know, or atheists at least, who say it was the simplicity of this, you know, law of natural selection working on mutation over time that allowed me to see that, you know, we don't have to have a sort of guiding hand or anything like that. I think that still leaves you with an awful lot. Darwinism, even if it can explain that, it still leaves an awful lot unexplained. There's an awful lot about our experience, about the world around us that doesn't fit into this very simplistic Darwinian model, though people like Dawkins have tried to apply it to almost everything in life. What's interesting is, in fact, this neo-Darwinian model has really come under scrutiny in the last several decades, and many people in the mainstream sort of scientific community are talking about a third way now in evolution. And there's all kinds of ways in which that very simple model that apparently required no purpose, no teleology, is being questioned. And in fact, just the way that biologists are now seeing the way that the cell works, the way that life develops, just doesn't fit into this neat neo-Darwinian paradigm any longer. So I think that the theory itself is actually in flux. That's not to say there isn't obviously gradual development over time. It's just this idea that it's just random mutation and natural selection doesn't work actually. In the vast majority of cases, you can see cells adapting in real time in ways that simply cannot be made sense of by this sort of very simple neo-Darwinian principle. So I think there's all kinds of things within the science itself which suggests it's not nearly as simple, and it's not quite as much of a slam dunk as Richard Dawkins would like us to believe when it comes to sort of getting rid of purpose and agency in biology. Having said all that, you know, I think ultimately I would say you can't sort of get rid of God by simply saying here's a scientific process. You've still got all those underlying questions about, well, where did this process itself come from? The reality is you can't get an evolutionary process going without an original self-replicating molecule. If science has shown us anything, it's shown us that the origins of life are far more difficult to explain on a naturalistic basis than anyone ever anticipated. Very difficult to see just how and why the first DNA molecule would have come into being without some kind of agency, purpose, intelligence, call it what you like, at work. It's getting a kind of naturalistic theory. People have been trying to do it for a long time, and it's just they're coming up empty every time. Now, you know, the critics say, well, this is just a God of the gaps. We need to sort of wait, and, you know, eventually we'll come up with a naturalistic explanation. The problem is you can equally commit the problem of a naturalism of the gaps, where you sort of you will refuse to countenance the idea that there's some kind of meaning, purpose, or intelligence going on in the process because you're so committed to a sort of completely naturalistic way of attracting it. And so we don't want a God of the gaps, but we don't want a naturalism of the gaps. We need to follow the evidence where it leads. And for me, I think actually the evidence is, again, even in those sort of scientific processes of what we know about life, pointing in the direction of what I would call God. So that's my kind of overall take on that. Though these are obviously huge issues that move around all the time.
Well, what do you make of those kind of Christians who, like Ken Ham? I don't know if you've heard of Ken Ham, who
I
holds
do.
for a 7-day creation, and he's got this ark in Kentucky and such like. What's your view of that?
So Young Earth Creationists, I've had a number of conversations with them, hosted a number of conversations. I respect the position that they take. I don't agree with it myself. I think personally, I don't think we're obliged to interpret the early chapters of Genesis in the way they do. And I've always understood those early chapters of Genesis describing the 6 days of creation as essentially poetic, and they're meant to tell us why God created rather than how God created. And I believe God's given us, you know, two books, if you like, of revelation: the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And we're meant to go and explore both to the best of our ability. And our best science, as far as I can say, is very clearly pointing to the fact that we live in a very old universe, an extraordinary universe in all kinds of ways. But we shouldn't set the Bible against the best science, because I think God's behind both of them.
Okay, let's move on from existence to values, because that's another area which you claim is a significant support for Christian views. The idea that Christianity and the idea of a God gives value to human life. Where do you let me put the question to you this way. What about those people who are unbelievers, who are atheists? You mentioned the new atheists. Where do they get their values from if Christianity is the central plank of where values come from?
Well, the first thing to say is I know many very moral atheists, and in
Mm.
my argument in this particular chapter is not that atheists are all immoral by any means. In fact, I know many atheists who are very concerned about justice and truth and love and
Yeah.
everything else. So I wouldn't want it to be misunderstood in that way. But the question you're asking is, where do atheists get their moral values from? By what yardstick, if you like, do they measure their actions? And I would say it was contained in your question. I think atheists who live in the West are essentially drawing their morality from the Judeo-Christian tradition upon which the West is founded. It
Well,
just, as Tom Holland pointed out in that debate with AC Grayling, when you look at where all of for the past 50 years, that the humanist conferences have taken place, they all happen to have taken place in the West. And it's not an accident, because essentially humanism in its sort of secular form is essentially, as Tom Holland puts it, a sort of Protestant heresy. It's basically taking the morality that Christianity gave us and sort of trying to strip God out of it, so that we love our neighbor as we love ourselves. It's just we have no reference to God within that. But the problem is, the question is, well, does atheism per se bring you to these moral conclusions? Well, no. Atheism is a value neutral project. It doesn't have anything to say really about how we should or shouldn't treat each other. Likewise
you have
with science, Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say you have a very interesting conversation relayed in your book with Richard
Mm,
Dawkins,
mm,
who you put on the spot in this matter about what is good and what is not good. The conversation is about rape in particular, as
mm,
to whether that is something which is a bad thing, and if so, why is it bad?
mm.
And I think Dawkins initially says he refuses to answer that question, which I found quite startling. And when he does kind of explore it, you point out to him that ultimately what he's saying is that if it just comes from an evolutionary choice, then it's arbitrary and there is no good in it or bad in it. It's
Yeah, I mean, I'll quote you the very conversation, because I do spell it out in the book. We're having this conversation about whether we can, whether, for instance, the idea that rape is wrong is just a byproduct of purely evolutionary forces, or whether there's something really right and wrong about it. And he said, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. I said, but therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. And he said, well, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural. To which I replied, okay, but ultimately your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. And he responded, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and in a sense, you should say that
would say that, yes.
if you're a thoroughgoing atheist, naturalist like Richard Dawkins. Our beliefs about anything are essentially just a product of a sort of process that is beyond us, that doesn't really aspire to things being right or wrong, true or false. It's just about survival of the fittest in the end.
Yeah.
But most of us recoil at the idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand that the sociocultural forces of evolution have dealt us. We believe there are really right and wrong ways of treating other human beings, regardless of what the moral consensus may be at any particular time. And if there was a time in Roman history, for instance, when a senior Roman male could have his pick of whoever he wanted, who was his social inferior. There have been these kind of cultures where rape was considered fine, for some people. So was that simply the way it was for them? If morality is simply a kind of whatever happens to fall out in a particular culture, well, most of us, I think, would say no, they were wrong. they got it wrong. We've improved since then. We know better than they knew. And if that's all of that's true, then what you're appealing to is a standard outside of evolutionary principles or science or whatever.
Yes,
You're appealing to a standard that exists beyond you. And for me, there's only one way of grounding that, and that's in the idea that there is a moral lawgiver outside of nature. And I think that's the difficulty for an atheist like Richard Dawkins. They would like to say that there's a sort of grounding for their moral beliefs, but it's very difficult to on atheism.
which comes first, the moral absolute or God? In other words, is something good because God commands it, or is it that God commands it because it is good?
Well, this you're stating, as I'm sure you know, a classic sort of
Yeah, I
objection
know. I am.
to
That
the
did
moral
not think of
argument,
it.
Euthyphro's dilemma.
Yeah,
And yeah, it's an interesting, helpful way of
it's,
framing it.
it's that's a question of primacy, though, isn't it?
Yes,
Does
yes.
God define the good, or does
Hmm.
God, and therefore God comes first, or
Hmm.
does the good come first and God just approves of it because it's good?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, I think the problem for me with Euthyphro's dilemma is that it's a false dichotomy. That you either have God defining the good, and therefore good kind of becomes somewhat arbitrary, or the good exists and God just points you in the direction of it. Therefore, the good somehow is superior to God, or God hasn't, you know. I would just say God is the good. That when the Bible says, for instance, God is love, you cannot separate these two things. That so I would just, as one philosopher calls it, split the horns of the dilemma. There is It simply is that God is just completely concurrent with the good, and you shouldn't try to separate those two things as though they're separate
Well, the,
categories.
the solution is simply, I would have thought that those categories of good are merely representative of the inherent character of God. You could put it that way.
Yes, yes, that's another way of putting it. I think it's essentially the same thing as saying. I think for me, you know, it's helpful to kind of try and work out some of the philosophical answers to these questions. I would say even with Euthyphro's dilemma, it still leaves atheists with a question though, which is simply, why should we do the things that you say we should do? You know, the moral things. Where do this not just the values come from, but the duty to undertake this morality? Because that's what morality is at the end of the day. It's the idea that you should do something, not just that someone happens to have a sort of a set of moral beliefs. And
Yeah.
again, I find it very difficult to come to an answer on that on a purely naturalistic worldview. All it is in the end is what we're handed by nature. There's no shoulds, you know. How do you get the ought from the is of nature? And so I think even before you get to the question of where do these moral values reside? How do you make sense of it? You know, some sort of divine command theory and everything else. You just do have a problem as an atheist with the idea of believing in moral values and duties. And yeah, I think that's a harder dilemma than
No.
the Euthyphro dilemma, if you like.
Okay. Yeah, closely allied to human values is human purpose, and you deal with that in another chapter. What does Christianity actually teach us about why we're here? What's the purpose of life itself?
Well, you know, it's the great question, isn't it? And one that many people have tried to answer.
Or
I think
what is the chief end of man, as some Puritans
indeed,
said?
yes. To what's the Westminster Catechism? Is it to know God and to enjoy Him forever, or to
That's right, yes.
yeah? And that's a good answer, I think. As a Christian, I'd say, you know, Jesus answers it very directly when he's asked these types of questions. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And I think in that sense, for a Christian, the answer to what is the meaning or the purpose of life is found in this person, Jesus, that he somehow defines within himself what it is life is about, and that those who find their life, as he puts it, they find it in him rather than anywhere else. So for me, that's the defining answer, the person of Jesus. And I think in the end, again, it's another signpost towards God. The fact that people do across all times, places, and cultures ask this question: what am I here for? What's the purpose of life? Um, Again, it would be a very cruel trick for a purely purposeless process of evolution to have pulled on us, that it turns out that every single culture across time and place looks for these answers beyond nature, looks for these answers in a transcendent cause. And I think for me, that's, again, it's not a proof, but it is a sign that there's more, that we are wired, if you like, to look for purpose beyond the physical everyday. And ultimately, yeah, I believe that God came and showed us what life looks like in all its fullness by coming in person. And for me, that's very important. It would be a shame. I think we haven't got the full story if we simply settle for a sort of interesting philosophical argument for the existence of God. This has to be something that makes a difference in our lives. And obviously at the core, at the heart of Christianity is this extraordinary, scandalous claim that God himself stepped in to show us what life is like as a human.
You have a whole chapter devoted to Jesus, and
Mm.
I suppose the question has to be, how is Jesus different from any of the other moral teachers, Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius, those kind of things? Where is the difference here?
Well, the big difference most Christians would say is that Jesus claimed to be God, put himself on a par with God, and that simply wasn't the case with those other teachers. And so when he points to God, he points to himself. He talks in these terms about being the way, the truth, and the life, and in a sense is not simply a moral teacher, but the one who ultimately did what was needed to bring us back into relationship with God. So rather than simply telling us how to live, and showing us how to live, he also gave us the way in which we can enter into that life through his death and resurrection. So these are all, essential foundational aspects of
There.
Christian faith and Jesus that I think mark out Jesus as different. I suppose the question is, you can sort of obviously get a great deal of help and understanding and wisdom from simply looking at Jesus' teachings, but to leave it at that, as C.S. Lewis said, is to do a disservice really to Jesus, because that wasn't his intention. He didn't want us to just take away some helpful moral teaching. He wanted to see that he was pointing to himself as Lord rather than just as this sort of useful moral educator.
There's rather a huge claim. In fact, it's probably the biggest claim you can make, that one particular person is in fact God himself. Is there any evidence that you would have for that?
Well, the prime one I would probably point people to is the fact that I believe Jesus rose again, and that there's good evidence for his physical resurrection, and that, if you like, is a vindication of his claim to be the Son of God. I again spend a whole chapter of this book looking at the historical evidence surrounding the resurrection of Christ, and I think many skeptics and atheists that I meet are quite surprised to see actually just some of the historical evidence that seems to be there for that. So I'd say it's not that we've sort of just been left it, as it were, on blind faith. We don't sort of have to just accept this as a sort of thing that you sort of believe or don't believe. I think we have been left sufficient evidence to make a considered and rational decision to believe that something happened 2,000 years ago. And to that extent, I think there's good evidence to believe what Jesus said about himself. I think you also have to take into consideration the fact that this is unarguably the person in all of world history who has had the most extraordinary effect upon the world. And who was he? He was just a relative unknown in a backwater of the Roman Empire, who went around teaching and preaching for 3 years before getting himself crucified. And yet we mark history in the eras before and after his life. As I say, the world has been completely changed in his name. So there's something about that as well, the impact that means I think you have to take him seriously. He wasn't just another sort of messianic pretender. This was the one who something happened, and so both that historical piece around the resurrection and the impact of Jesus, I think, should give any skeptic pause for thought on whether this is more than just another figure of history.
I think that probably does focus in on the one crucial piece of evidence. I know that people like Jordan Peterson,
Mm,
for example, who have been let's say at the moment on the outskirts or maybe inside
mm,
the realm of Christianity.
mm,
I can't quite tell
mm,
where he is. has often been pushed on this
Mm,
particular question as to whether he believes in the physical resurrection of Jesus
mm.
Christ, because that I think is the crucial element. And I can't think that he's actually given an answer to that which has been satisfactory. He's always said, from what I recall, things like that we don't know what's possible when you are that focused on being connected to God.
Yes, yes,
You
yes.
go further on that, though, would
Well,
you?
it's a bit difficult to nail down, certainly. I will say though that someone who's a friend of mine, Alex O'Connor, who's a young atheist YouTuber, who's had the opportunity for a couple of interactions with Jordan Peterson. He probably did the best job I've seen of sort of holding his feet to the fire and getting a really straight answer out of him. And he essentially asked him, "Look, Jordan, if you had had a video camera and you were holding it by the tomb, uh, on that day, would you have seen a man, Jesus, walk out of the tomb?" And to be fair to him, Peterson said, "Yeah, I think on balance you would." So that seemed to be about as close as
Well, that's as
Peterson has
close as
ever.
you're going to get, I think,
Yeah,
from
yeah,
people.
exactly. I understand why he's a bit skittish about sort of nailing his colours to that mast. I mean, Peterson takes a very sort of psychological Jungian approach to the
Yeah.
Bible, and he seems far less concerned about its historicity and so on than its meaning and symbolism and everything else. The problem for me is of course the Bible is full of symbolism and meaning, and can be used for all kinds of psychological purposes, but that shouldn't be used. But the only reason it's so useful is, I believe, because it's true, because it actually describes real events in space-time history. And for me, as St. Paul said, if Jesus is not raised, and he meant that in a very physical way, anastasis means standing up in Greek. If he's not raised, then we're to be pitied, because ultimately our faith is in vain. If Jesus is just a sort of spiritual concept or idea and didn't rise physically, then it's kind of saying, well, Christianity is just a sort of spiritual it's about a different realm that we are actually not part of. But actually, Christianity is about the real physical flesh and blood world. And Jesus, by rising in his physical form, said something important about the goodness of God's physical flesh and blood world.
So
And
the
that,
truth of
yeah,
Christianity is rooted in certainly this event. That if it's
yes,
not true,
absolutely.
it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we move on to another chapter of yours? Because you now start to look at the atheist's greatest objection to not only Christianity, but even to the idea of there being a God, which is the problem of suffering, which I think has been debated for thousands of years. What's your own personal take on that particular problem? Why is there suffering in a world which is created by a God who is good?
Yes. Well, again, we're covering huge topics
Yeah.
in every one of these
Well, they're in your
questions.
book, so I thought,
They are, they are. And even one chapter is really not enough. You can only do a very surface level treatment of these
I mean,
questions.
just to make it more strongly,
Mm,
Stephen Fry is on record
mm,
as saying that he could never believe in a God which was so wicked and
mm,
callous as to allow children to suffer cancer.
mm,
And
mm.
that's a very personal
Yeah,
kind of thing, isn't it? It brings it home to you,
yeah.
the pain of suffering. What's your response?
Well, the first thing I would say is I totally understand why someone like Fry would have that kind of response. It's completely understandable. Indeed, if you go to the scriptures, you will find people having that response to suffering. The oldest part of scripture is arguably the book of Job, in which this question gets asked, and there is just as much anguish and scandal when it comes to why would God allow these things. Um, there are lots of different directions you can go in. Some of them will be more or less helpful depending on the kinds of questions someone is asking, but there are, if you like, more philosophical responses for just the pure kind of philosophical question of why a good all-powerful God would allow a world of suffering and evil to exist. And I think some of those are helpful, what you might call theodicies. These would include the fact that God has allowed free will to exist, and that, of course, is responsible for a great amount of the suffering and evil we find in the world. But what would the world be like if God removed free will, if God sort of stepped in at every moment that someone was going to misuse their freedom and sort of stop that from happening, well, we would just be robots, automatons. And the question is, well, would that be a better world? Well, arguably no, because it's only through freedom, free will, that we can experience what it means to be human, to love, to do things out of our own volition and so on. So I think there are some helpful responses, if you like, philosophically. That's called the free will defense. And then, but then there's this question of why do some of these things that we don't seem to have that much control over, natural disasters, illness, bone cancer in children, as Stephen Fry says. Well, again, I think you sort of have to kind of look at this from within the Christian worldview and say, well, what answer do the scriptures give? Does the life of Jesus sort of point us towards? And the answer there is that we live in a broken world. We live in a world that has gone off kilter at some level because of sin, because of this idea that we've somehow the world has been marred by our choices to go in our own direction. And as the book of Romans puts it, it's as if the whole of creation is groaning, like a woman in childbirth. And the question is, well, if this is the state of our world, if this is what it looks like, what is God doing about it? Has God left us, just to face that by ourselves? Well, no, God has stepped in. God has chosen to become part of his groaning creation in Jesus Christ. And through his death and resurrection has given us the pathway, if you like, to find freedom and hope and renewal and the restoration of all things. But it's a painful process, there's absolutely no doubt. But even in that, even in the pain of the world as we experience it, I think there are all kinds of ways, and I tried to sketch this out in a few ways in this chapter, that God can still work through the difficulty and the pain. So we all probably know people who can only help someone else, say as a counselor in Alcoholics Anonymous, because they themselves have experienced addiction. There are so many instances in which we can only grow as a person of generosity and love because there are people in need. So there's a sense in which God, I believe, can still use even difficult and awful situations very often to actually bring about the people he wants us to be, and indeed bring people to himself. I know many people for whom it's been difficulty and hardship rather than comfort and ease that have actually drawn them to their knees and forced them to embrace and look for God. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which we can try to make sense of this. We can try to understand the ways in which God might, the reasons often beyond most of which are well beyond our understanding, but the fact that God could have good reasons to allow such a world to exist.
You tie
Yes.
suffering back to Genesis and the Garden of Eden and the fall, or does suffering have a different origin?
Well, there are different sort of theological thoughts and explanations on this, and if I'm honest, I'm to some extent a bit agnostic on it, because all I know is that we live in this broken world. How it got broken is arguably something you could look in different ways. Certainly, what the fall describes is this idea of humans rebelling against God, and that certainly seems to fit with a lot of the suffering we do see in the world. It's us turning away from God that is the cause, and using our freedom in all kinds of misappropriating it in all kinds of ways that causes so much suffering. But the Bible also sort of has hints in it of a kind of almost angelic fall, that almost seems to predate or is somehow in a different sphere of reality almost to
Milton is
ours.
very good at describing
Yes,
what he
yes,
believes about hell.
exactly. And this idea that, if you like, the fact that in the garden there is a snake who tries to persuade the humans to do the wrong thing. It's a sign that somehow evil has already crept in from the outset. And so there's a sense in which a lot of people would say there was a kind of rebellion at a kind of cosmic level that introduced the kind of the dynamic that we now see, this whole universe kind of out of kilter, as I said. And to that extent, what we're looking at is not just the realm of human freedom, but also the realm of spiritual entities that have their own type of freedom and have chosen to rebel against God. So it's still a case of created beings misusing their freedom. It's just we're talking about this on a sort of cosmic spiritual level at this point.
What
And
what about
yeah,
the other end of history? Do you believe in hell?
I wouldn't want to sort of suggest that these are just two sides of the same coin, because hell is
just that
very
hell
different
hell
to.
is a place of eternal suffering.
Yes,
And the problem of
absolutely.
suffering has to be tied in with that. I'm just wondering what
Yeah.
your personal view of that is.
I so the reason I wouldn't want to sort of tie the problem of evil and suffering with the issue of hell is that I think they're described that while we might say hell is a place of suffering, we wouldn't say it's a place of evil necessarily, because if the hell is described as anything, it's a place of justice actually.
No, I said
Um,
eternal suffering. It's
yes,
eternal
yes.
suffering. Yeah.
But as it happens, and I do spell this out again in the book, my personal view on the issue of hell is not what has often been described as the eternal conscious torment view. This idea that there's a sort of place of never-ending sort of punishment and retribution, if you like, but rather that I think what you actually find described in Scripture and what seems to make most sense ethically and morally, theologically to me, is the idea that there is an end to all those who ultimately choose not to put their trust in God. I don't believe God sort of holds in existence while, I believe there'll be a new creation, a new heavens, a new earth, and that everything will be set right. And it doesn't seem to me consistent with that you would still have this outpost sort of in rebellion against God in a place that we might call hell. I believe that it makes more sense to see that actually those who choose not to be part of that kingdom have chosen to cut themselves off from the source of life. And ultimately there's, if you like, it's sometimes called the annihilationist point of view, that those who choose not to be part of God's kingdom have chosen to simply go out of existence. So that's my perspective. And I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation of the imagery of hell that we actually find in Scripture, whether it be Gehenna, this rubbish pit outside Jerusalem. It's images of things being burned up and extinguished, essentially, not constantly sort of held there and never actually being sort of destroyed, if you like. So
I think
for
it is
me,
a respectable view from Christians. I think John Stott held that view
that's
ultimately.
correct.
He
Yes.
was
Yeah.
criticised for it. Can I move you on? Because I know time is escaping. I've got a few more questions I want to throw at you, simply because they're in your book. And you move on to the point of New Atheism, version 2.0, you call it. This has been focused in around Hitchins and Dawkins and Harris and Daniel Dennett and those kind of people some of whom you've spoken to, if not all of them you may have spoken to, I don't know. You claimed, particularly in your first book, that the new atheism is declining. And I just wondered, 2 years later on from that book and that statement, do you still hold that view that the new atheism is in decline, or have you changed your mind on that at all?
No, I haven't changed my mind. I'd say, if anything, as you say, it's been a year and a half, nearly 2 years since I published The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And the subtitle was Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And I'd say actually in the year and a half to 2 years since publishing the book, that thesis has actually been proved more true than I ever anticipated. I really don't think anyone is new atheism is a completely spent force. It only really exists in sort of certain side rooms of the internet these days, where people still kind of bang on in new atheist ways about the dangers of faith and Christianity. All the new atheists, essentially, Dawkins, Harris, and co, they turned their attention away from bashing institutional religion and have all got knee deep into the culture wars now. So they hardly are, and where they are often engaged with people of faith, they're often actually surprising bedfellows with them. They often are co-belligerents on issues like the LGBT stuff and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Well,
the landscape has changed really significantly, and I would say, in some ways, I would be even firmer in what I said in the book now.
what did you say to the fundamental thrust, which I think was that religion is really not just wrong, but an evil force, that it's actually the cause of more wars than anything else. And if you look at terroristic acts today, where young children are being killed with knives and all kinds of things, it's a religious force often behind that. What's your
Well,
argument?
there's no doubt that religion gets co-opted for all kinds of things. But I think it was just incredibly historically naive for the new atheists to claim that religion is the source of all of this stuff. If you're just looking at the body counts from the 20th century, atheistic regimes in Soviet Russia and elsewhere, and China, communist China, had far more blood on their hands than any
Yeah,
religious sort
we're
of
talking about hundreds of
conflicts.
millions here, aren't we?
Yeah. So if it's just on that metric, it's just plainly obvious. In fact, people have done proper surveys on this. There was some research done looking at this claim that most conflicts have some kind of religious basis to them. In fact, it was found that only a minority of conflicts do, and the vast majority are essentially not religious, even if they are sometimes presented at some level. They are actually about territory and power and everything else. Obviously, I believe religion can be misused and very often is the cause of but then that's to me is the common denominator is the fact that we're human and we will misappropriate and misuse anything, in some way or another. And it's also important, obviously, to differentiate between different religions. The new atheism really got going on the back of 9/11. And I'm not going to disagree with the new atheists who said there is an inherent way of being able to translate the Quran that could incite some people to violence. I think sadly that is true, that it's not too difficult to use the Quran in that kind of a way. I think it's much harder to use the Bible in that way because at the center of the Bible, of the Christian scripture certainly, is the person of Jesus Christ, who said, "Put away your sword," when Peter
Yeah.
struck off the ear of the high priest's servant. So there's any Christian who does use um, you know Christianity as a pretext for violence is going directly against, as far as I can see, the plain reading of what we have in the words of Jesus. And to that extent, I think, again, it's just historically naive of the new atheists to imagine that their morality, as we said earlier, just came out of some sort of scientific enlightenment rationalism. It didn't. It came from Christianity, and that's what I think is becoming increasingly apparent, is that the principles of Christianity that shaped the West have actually been rather good for us, not bad for us.
Yeah.
And I see lots and lots of these new atheists actually starting to even accept that point. And I suspect many of the books they once wrote along these lines, they would not write today.
That's a fair enough comment. Okay. In your penultimate chapter of your new book, you talk about other reasons why people might be put off Christianity. And one in particular, you mentioned deconstruction, which a term I'd not come across in this context before. But ultimately, what do you say to people who maybe they've had a faith or they've been put off Christianity because of the church or
Mm.
because of Christians? I wouldn't want to join a group of people like that.
Well, I have a great deal of sympathy for that. And very often the worst advert for Christianity are Christians, sadly. But what I would want to encourage people, and the word deconstruction has become a bit of a buzzword in recent years, and hence in this updated version of this book, I wanted to include a chapter on it because there was a period certainly where a lot of high profile figures were suddenly announcing that they were deconverting from Christianity and so on. I think that period has somewhat started to come to an end. And I think the main problem is that too much, especially in places like North America, Christianity has been sort of allied with a very particular political expression. It has often been seen as one and the same with a particular conservative evangelical expression. And for me, the problem is Christianity, obviously, it's not that you can't be a Christian and within those boundaries, but to kind of define Christianity that way would be a mistake, because Christianity is obviously far broader than that. It has existed across many times, places and cultures. And, there are far more Christians in, Africa today than there are in Western Europe. And so I think it's sometimes helpful to pull back and ask, well, have I really, what I've questioned and abandoned just a certain cultural instantiation of Christianity? And there might be good reason to do that, actually. But when you actually simply ask, well, what is the foundation? What is the core of Christianity? Mere Christianity, as C.S. Lewis put it. I find that tends to stand up quite well, actually. And sometimes it's a good thing to deconstruct these sort of very cultural versions of Christianity. But let's be open to the idea of reconstructing as well, because if you're sort of just deconstructing and then sort of leaving the pieces of the puzzle on the floor, or adopting secular atheism or whatever, you're not really solving the question. Actually, you're just sort of swapping one, I think, faulty worldview for another probably faulty worldview. I think it's worth doing the work of actually picking apart the things that are unhelpful, but actually putting it back together again afterwards.
Okay. Your final chapter in your book, Choosing to Live in the Christian Story, has an interesting elements in it, and some challenging elements too. One which I found particularly interesting was something you called the atheist prayer experiment.
Mm.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, this was something rather fun that I did several years ago. So for many years, I hosted a discussion show called Unbelievable. And I would bring Christians and atheists on together to discuss and debate ideas. And I was approached by an Oxford philosopher called Tim Mawson at one point to do something along the lines of encouraging atheists to actually try praying. And he had written a paper where he had essentially said, it's a bit like Pascal's wager. You might as well try praying. You've got nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain if you're an atheist. Why not pray to ask God to reveal himself to you? And I thought this could be rather fun to put this into practice. And so we managed to persuade, by putting a call out online, about 70 or so atheists to start praying once a day for 40 days. Seemed like a suitably biblical sort of number. And just to see what happened. And I was getting them to sort of log that through sort of personal journals, or they could sort of
Sorry,
contribute.
when you say pray once a day, what do you mean? I mean, are we talking about half
Well,
an hour,
all,
1 minute?
all we asked, no, we didn't define it too specifically, but we just asked everybody at some point in the day to ask, to take a moment and to just pray as best they could to ask God to reveal himself to them. That was all we were asking them to do. And some people, but people could sort of take that in different ways. They might have different ways of trying to do that. And that was all. I should stress, this was not some sort of rigorous scientific experiment. There was no double-blind testing or anything like that. It was just a bit of a fun idea just to see what would happen. And it was very interesting because it led to all kinds of interesting conversations with the various atheists who took part. I mean, a good number didn't end up doing it, maybe tried for a few days, but sort of lost interest. Some who did kind of manage to do the thing all the way through said, didn't hear anything. Some said, lots of weird things happened. I was much more self-aware. I had all kinds of unusual coincidences occur. One even said they felt they heard an audible voice at one point when they prayed. Interestingly, none of them, those examples said it led me to faith, I started to believe in God or anything like that. They kind of found other ways of explaining, what they'd felt, and perhaps it was the fact that they were in a more kind of calm, meditative state, and they, or perhaps they were more willing to sort of see connections, notice things than they would have otherwise been, and so on. But still, it was an interesting result. There were just two people who came to faith via the experiment, interestingly, two ladies. The interesting thing was, and I suppose as a Christian, I think this is sort of God's sense of humor, do not put the Lord your God to the test and all that. In both cases, strictly speaking, they became Christians outside of the bounds of the experiment. One of these ladies started praying sort of as soon as we announced it, rather than waiting for the official start time, and says that she just immediately, almost the moment she began praying, suddenly she realized there was a God, and it made sense to her. So officially, she sort of that happened outside of the bounds of the thing. The other one, I'm trying to recall now. I need to go back and read the chapter, but she was pregnant at the time, and again, I think she had this experience when she gave birth, having sort of decided she was going to do this, of suddenly just, yeah, she does believe in God, and again, but it actually fell outside of the bounds of the the timings, as it were. So that it was amusing to me that the two people who did claim to have encountered God from having been atheists.
I think if I recall, it was looking at her baby, the fact
That's
that
right.
you
Yes,
can't
right.
imagine that
Yeah.
this is just
Yeah.
a random collection of atoms, and that
Yeah.
there's more than that to a human being and to
which is very understandable. Yes. So yes, that it was fun. I suppose I talked about that towards the end of the book, because I wanted to make the point that Christianity is not just something you sort of assent to intellectually. It has to be something you end up doing or trying out. And that was just one sort of quite fun sort of way in which I gave people the opportunity to just dip their toe in and see whether this made sense.
Well, that's
in the end. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, that's a question which I'm just picking up what you're saying, which I wanted to ask towards the end here, and that is, you say that you believe, looking at the whole of the book, there are many almost philosophical reasons as to why you should believe, or why you believe in God, because you say it makes sense of everything. It makes sense of existence, and it makes sense of purpose. It makes sense of values, those kind of things. But is that all? That it's a satisfying intellectual exercise, or is there something more? And if so, what is it?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because at one level, yes, I did write the book sort of to give people intellectual permission to take Christianity seriously. But if that's all it remains, if it remains just an intellectual proposition, then it won't do much for you, you know. And the fun of Christianity is actually, once we've perhaps summoned up the courage and we've perhaps put the pieces together, it's actually playing the game. It's actually going into it. And the analogy I use at the end of the book is, you know, a story told by an Anglican evangelist, Michael Green, about a young woman who was on a quest trying to work out whether God existed, and had been having conversations with a Christian friend. And this Christian friend eventually took her to a church, and it had these kind of very tall, quite forbidding, dark panes of windows that from the outside looked very grey and dull and lifeless. And but this friend then took her to the entrance and inside the church. And once she entered into the church, the sunlight from outside streamed through these stained glass windows and bathed the whole interior in this beautiful glow and warmth and color. And he made the simple point, you know, Christianity is rather like that. You can spend a long time on the outside asking important questions, but it's only once you step inside and experience it from the inside that you'll really understand it. You know, who was it? The church father who said, I believe in order to understand. It's actually about entering into something that will ultimately encounter it for what it truly is. So I would that was what I wanted to leave people with. Having written a book that deals with a lot of the intellectual arguments and so on, the worst thing to do would be to leave it there. It's about actually then going and trying it on.
Justin Brierley, thank you ever so much for your time today and for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Philip.